Hello, Molly Shani, and welcome to this edition of a Dialogue Special, charting a new course of China-Africa cooperation, co-produced by CGTN and Zambia National Broadcasting Corporation. For 15 years, China has maintained its position as the top trading partner of Africa, marking a successful period of cooperation. After decades of effort by both, what are the achievements of this cooperation? And to talk of individual countries, how have China and Zambia helped each other and benefited mutually? Finally, in today's turbulent world, how can China and its African partners navigate a higher quality relationship? That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. From Zambia, we are joined by my counterpart, Rafael Kumwanda. Over to you, Rafael.
Thank you, Shindu. I'm Rafael Kumwanda, indeed, from the Zambia National Broadcasting Corporation. It's great to have this interface and collaboration as Zambia shares mutual interest with China, which dates back to Zambia's independence. In fact, this 24th October, Zambia marks 60 years of its independence. In fact, President Hakainde Hichilema is among several heads of state attending the 2024's Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, and the theme is joining hands to advance modernization and build a high-level China-Africa community with a shared future. Joining us from the University of Zambia is Mr. Evans Daka. He is a lecturer in foreign policy and international relations. We also have a trade expert, Gilbert Nkamba. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Well, joining us from China, Jody Yu Zhou Sun, Associate Professor in Modern African and Global History at the Department of History, Fudan University, and Professor John Gong at the University of International Business and Economics. Welcome to Dialogue. And so I will start with Jody. Give us a broad picture as national leaders from China and the African countries gather in Beijing for this forum on the cooperation between China and Africa. So where are we now? I guess you have the past in your mind, the present, probably the future of China-Africa in your mind. Share it with us, please.
Thank you very much for this kind invitation. It's a great pleasure to be invited and particularly to talk to my dear colleagues in Lusaka. Zambia was the first country I visited for my research in 2016. Why it was so important in China-Africa relations? Because China established diplomatic relations with Zambia ever since its national independence. And since then, President Kaunda at the time, who was also the leader of the United National Independence Party, decided to have this coordination with Chinese leaders in designing for a fair and more kind of collaborative world order. So in the sense that Zambia had really, really close and warm political relations with China since day one. And throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we've witnessed the ever-growing closer relations. And of course, one of the symbolization of that relations is the construction of the Tanzania-Tazara railway that we saw today. Of course, China-Zambia relations politically were good, and economically, they also mutually beneficial. China had been developing a lot of industries in Zambia, including in mining sectors and construction sectors. And in recent years, China has expanded its influence in Zambia in cultural sectors too. For example, the construction of the Confucian Institute at the University of Zambia, as well as the kind of introduction of several cultural collaboration programs as well. And medical aid was also part of that larger picture in the sense that China dispatched a lot of medical doctors too. So I would say that China-Zambia relations were ever closer, and I'm happy to see more kind of practical deals being signed during the FOCAC meeting.
There's also the historical perception on how the Western colonial powers came to Africa and reportedly caused huge upheavals, some of it positive, but much of it devastating. Then came, of course, China. I would like to pose this question to you, Mr. Evans Daka. How do you view this interest from China? Some have coined it another scramble for Africa. How is China's way of engagement?
Now, to talk about the differences in the way Western relations are crafted and those of coming from the East, or particularly from China, there are differences that we can actually point out. with the Western, engagements, the main emphasis is that African countries like Zambia need, first of all, to adhere, or to address rather what we call the concept of good governance, meaning that you need to work on issues to do with human rights. You need to improve the way you conduct elections, issues of transparency and accountability. All these, principles of good governance must be addressed before, the West would move in and engage with you. With the Chinese, they perceive that to be an element of intervention in a political system, an element of intervention in the governance of a country that they're trying to engage with. Therefore, they do not put much of conditions in the engagement. All they do is actually to employ diplomacy, discuss, and then establish areas of engagement.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, obviously, more investment either from China or from any country in Zambia, in African countries, that's good. Good to the business, good to the creation of jobs, taxes, for example. But at the same time, for the big ticket infrastructure projects, often it's loans from the Chinese side, and then there's accusation, in particular from Western media, of the so-called debt trap. It's like China is setting a trap for African countries. What's really going on? Why there is such an accusation? What's the purpose of such talk?
Okay, well, first of all, let me start by saying the importance of infrastructure. Without infrastructure, Africa can industrialize, Africa cannot move into more value-added industries, cannot be engaging manufacturing activities, which is certainly the path to modern societies, right? Now, so there's a need for infrastructure build-out in almost all aspects, in electric utility, in water, in port facility, highway, railway, and all these things are pretty expensive. As we have seen here in China, that we used to spend a lot of money on these things in the 1990s and early 2000s. Now, having said that, the idea that China sort of sets up a debt trap for Africa to borrow money from China to get into these things is absolutely not true. And I've seen some statistics saying that out of the total debt owned by African countries at aggregate level, only 15% is attributed to China, and the rest is actually commercial loans from Western banks and also from international institutions, actually. And furthermore, the interest rates associated with these loans from China Development Bank or China Export-Import Banks is way much lower than the interest rates associated with these commercial loans owned to Western financial institutions and other banks. So I think it's totally unfair to attributes all of this loan on China, which only holds about 15%. Now, finally, let me say this idea of trap, okay? Now, what is trap? Trap really means that it is something that was set out to be to swindle the borrowers at the very beginning. Essentially, it points to a conspiracy theory, right? And I don't think that the African officials signing these loan agreements are so foolish as to be swindled that way, right? The idea, so-called the trapped idea, is to lend money to you knowing that you won't be able to pay back the loans eventually, and that these loans will be transformed into an equity investment and essentially taking control of the whole assets. And that's what's called a trap. But I think it's really an insult to people's intelligence to assume that people actually borrowing the money got into this kind of a trap easily, not knowing that this is something set up to be not being able to pay it out anyway. So I think this whole idea, this debt trap, is first of all, it's not true, and second, I think it's totally insulting.
Mr. Evans Daka, I know you have something to say probably, from you are the expert on the international relations, we know that the US is, let's say, basically have this competition in mind, so-called geopolitical competition with China, basically to keep the US as #1. And the US Congress has basically earmarked a certain amount of money to encourage people to pick whatever, the Chinese investment in Africa, in other countries, or under the BRI, for example, to badmouth this project there. So what do you make of these, such talk like a debt trap there?
Okay, so these are terms that are developed basically for the purpose of propaganda. But nonetheless, if you critically look at why this issue of debt trap is coming up, is because of how most African countries borrow actually from China. Okay, like I mentioned earlier on, the Chinese do not put much conditions in terms of engaging with them. So most African countries like Zambia, they're actually at liberty to borrow as much as they can. So that is actually up to us Africans to realize that as we are borrowing, we should be conscious to say, do we really have the capacity to be able to pay back? Because once you borrow, what it implies that you need to pay back this money at some point, because the lender, the idea is that as the money is going to one country, other countries should also be able to benefit. So if one country fails to pay back, then that becomes a challenge. So you find that there is this issue of a debt trap based on the fact that most, or rather some of the countries in Africa are failing to pay back, and now they are seen maybe to be trapped in debt. And then people arguing, scholars, commentators arguing that most African countries have actually been caught up in a debt trap orchestrated by China, which is not the case. Actually, the issue starts with most African countries. We need to realize when we're borrowing that we should also at the same time have the capacity to be able to pay back the debt.
Well, let's move on to this specific relationship between China and Zambia, for example. The latest news is that three nations, China, Zambia, and Tanzania, have signed this MOU on the revitalization project of Tanzara. So this railway running through Zambia, Tanzania. Well, Gilbert, I mean, of course, tell us, what's the importance of this rail line for Zambia in terms of trade, in terms of passenger service, in terms of, say, investment, from other countries?
It is passing right in the maize belt. So much of the exports from this region finding its way right to the north. Besides, collaboration with Tanzania makes this particular passage very, very affordable to the Zambian businessmen. So economically, that is the greatest advantage. But again, on the other hand, the major export earner for Zambia is the mineral resources from the Copper Belt and Northwestern Province. This is the shortest route to the sea. This is the shortest non-obstructive route to the sea. Then revitalization means just that. It means there is less that is going to spend on making it actualized and running fully. So we have a very great advantage as a trading community. We are very enthusiastic about this development, and we were waiting for it like yesterday.
Well, China has invested in Zambia and undertaken multiple projects, especially in infrastructure construction, as already outlined. We have already seen lots of positive outcomes. How have those projects been operating so far, and what is next? Is there more space, for instance, where the two sides could upgrade their cooperation for mutual benefit? And Mr. Daka, you could help us with this question.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there are several projects, like you've mentioned. To be precise, we can appreciate how the Chinese have assisted us in coming up with a new airport, the KK, Kenneth Kaunda International Airport, which has actually improved, transportation, sector in our country. Beyond that, we've seen a number of, projects, even in the health sector. We have the Levi Mwanawasa, the hospital that has now complemented UTH. So all these projects really are actually very, very important for us, and they are, easing life for many Zambians. Beyond that, I think one major area that really I'm seeing which is affecting Zambia is an issue of climate change, and many of the challenges that we're facing currently, the issue of energy, the issue of food security, are actually bordering on climate change. So I feel really with this opportunity that China is presenting to us, particularly with the ongoing FOCAC, I think we can capitalize on that and ensure that we tap the necessary, support that we need to improve our energy sector, but also our food, security. So I think going forward, these are some of the areas that we should, tap from the opportunities that China is presenting to us.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, if you look at this interaction between China and Zambia in terms of investment, in terms of Zambian business people exploring opportunities in the China market, of course, people are talking about, digital gap, for example. In that sector, China is leading globally. China can obviously do some investment in Zambia and other African countries. And also in green energy, of course, is another sector people can work together. What do you see as probably the areas, the opportunities for both sides to get a closer cooperation in which, both sides will benefit from that kind of...
Yeah. Okay, before I answer your question, I want to add a few more things for the Tanzara. Let me first say that Tanzara is not built on a loan. It was a gift. It was a gift from China to Zambia and Tanzania. All the tracks, the workforce sent there to build are Chinese workers. A lot of them actually died over there. The trains, the locomotives are all from China. Now remember, we built this in the 1970s when China's GDP per capita is actually lower than many African countries at the time. And this goes to tell how much we actually dedicate to this friendship between China and these countries. So it was something that shouldn't be taken lightly. I think looking back, it was a great gift from China at the time. Our country is very poor in the 1970s. Now, having said that, let's go back to your question about this relationship between China and Zambia and African countries in general. I think today, trade and business interactions are booming between the two sides. And a lot of investments from China in African countries in general, a lot of businessmen from China actually working and operating in African countries. I think, to make this relationship economically sustainable as well as politically sustainable, one of the things we need to look at is how to balance this trade. If you look at China's trade with many African countries, it's actually, we export a lot, mostly manufactured products, then we import from these countries. And I think this situation has to be improved. Otherwise, it'll be a long-term problem. And I think the way to address this issue is to import more things from Africa, of course, and also add more value in those countries before they actually brought back to China. The products are brought back to China. Furthermore, I think there are a lot of areas that we can do in trade of services. I give you one example. Tourism, for example, right? Chinese tourists visiting African countries is, in a sense, an export of service from Africa to China. Yes. And this goes to help with balancing trade to some extent, right? So I think we need to look at this issue from a long-term perspective, how to make this relationship economically sustainable as well as politically sustainable.
Mm-hmm. After decades of globalization, we have started to see a tide receding. There are several possible reasons for that, such as the rise of nationalism, for instance, protectionism, as well as geopolitical uncertainties. Facing such a trend, how are African countries positioning themselves? What do you make of the geopolitical confrontation and competition between the big powers? Let's have you from the University of Zambia.
Okay, thank you very much. In fact, currently we are in a situation where the world is undergoing multiple, crises. It's a polycrisis. So we are seeing, confrontations, for instance, over the conflict in Ukraine, where the USA is seeming, supporting the Ukrainian government, but China also trying to, being neutral and, trying to find solutions for that, conflict. We also have misunderstandings or rather a conflict, serious one, in Gaza, where Israel is fighting Hamas. So at the center of these conflicts, we have these superpowers playing cardinal roles. Okay, the Chinese nonetheless have not, in their foreign policy come out to be confrontational, to be, forceful. They've actually crafted their foreign policy mainly based on dialogue, and it's a more reason why it has been very easy for most African countries to actually engage with them. So coming to Africa, I think this concept of non-alignment is very, very important when you look at the international system perceived from an angle which is actually portraying that it is anarchical and trying to side. So being neutral and probably just offering solutions that can bring an end to these confrontations, I think is the best. So for Zambia, in particular, as a country, I think we've done something, to ensure that we are neutral. For instance, over the conflict in Ukraine, we've clearly indicated that the solution through our president, that the solution is, dialogue, as opposed to, arming either of the sides. So basically, for any African country, the best when these superpowers are in a conflict, when these superpowers are actually competing, the best is to remain neutral, but at the same time, ensure that, we address our national interests by tapping whatever, opportunities they are able to present to us.
Jody, when we talk about this, big power competition, Africa here, it's really about why, whether that will affect, in a negative sense, the development of Africa, of the global community. Let's say the theme of this year's FOCAC, the Forum on Cooperation between China and Africa, is modernization, to advance modernization. We know China, we have this, so-called Chinese style modernization in Africa, and we are working together to advance, let's say, African modernization. You are a historian. Historically, how do you look at this issue? In African countries like Zambia, probably people would say, we are facing these challenges of, we are exporting raw materials, minerals, or agricultural products, but that's not enough. For industrialization and modernization, what needs to be done, by African nations, and also what kind of role China could play in that process?
Thank you for that question. First of all, this is a historically, it is a contested concept. We mean very different things. Conceptually, probably by design, it was quite Eurocentric, but then China has own definition and understanding, and of course, practical experience with modernization. So we talk about for modernization in all national development planning and various other public policy sphere. But I think what's really core in Africa's vision of modernization is the idea that you should have a long-term vision of understanding how national growth, and more balanced, harmonious kind of development could contribute to the wider population. It does not only mean economic growth only, but also the social benefits and welfare being provided to the whole national population. So in that sense, I think what's really important here is a more kind of sustainable way of doing business, but also to make that benefits of economic growth to be fairly distributed across the nation. And China, I think, had its own experience and positive ones to share to most of African countries in the sense that it went through different stages of development. And it is, of course, state initiative some of the economic reforms and so on, but private sector also played a huge role. So I think it's quite important to really understand the more kind of harmonious relationship between the public and the private sector. And this is what exactly most of the head of state of sub-Saharan African countries are looking up for. And China, I would think, would be able to provide some sort of, I think, both the good ones and the bad lessons and experience to their counterparts.
It's interesting as Jody makes that point. I'm just wondering from our economic expert, trade expert, what would be some of the new opportunities that Zambia could, potentially explore through its closer cooperation with China?
There are numerous opportunities. First of all, to pick on what Jody just said, that we follow a path of different stages of economic development. Where we are in Zambia, we have a very enthusiastic political leadership. Zambia cooperation with China is more economic, is more trade biased, and some of the areas where we can explore this is, we have seen a lot of leads in the aquaculture sector, which is the agricultural subsector in Zambia. We have so many river bodies where we can exploit that one and start exporting fish from our river bodies. Freshwater fish is a very essential commodity on the global trading platform. Then secondly, we have Chinese investment right into the remote areas of Zambia. We just have a sericulture factory in Mpika, which is about 600 kilometers north of Lusaka, that we invested in growing strawberries. Those strawberries are fed on some caterpillars that are used to produce silk. This is a new development, and it's a very big deal. The turnover per year is so massive. And once that is domesticated, that business is domesticated into the Zambian economy, we shall have the money banked with our local banks. We shall have our local insurance companies being given business. This multiplier effect is going to bring so much foreign exchange to the Republic of Zambia. And it's a new culture we are learning from China of growing mulberries to feed silkworms. Apart from that, even in the food processing industry is the only sector that survives even under pandemics. So we find massive investment in that sector, which is adding to the overall gross domestic product of the Republic of Zambia. Then we have also the Chinese taking a very huge stake in the mining sector. The Chambishi metals on the copper belt, the Chambishi non-ferrous metals, other mines being run by the Chinese. They're churning out so much turnover, and they're employing so many people on the copper belt, and that is having a very cushioning impact onto the government in terms of job creation. What is important is there is mutual benefit between the Republic of China and the Republic of Zambia, and that is what is very key in every investment. If Zambia can take a stake in the Chinese investment, and if the Chinese can benefit by partnering with Zambians, I mean, it will yield massive benefits for both economies.
On that note, we come to the end for today's show. Many thanks to our guests and Raffle.
And thank you very much, of course, for being a part of this conversation. We look forward to further engagements and collaboration. Thank you.
You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.
What's behind the next door? What motivates us to find the truth? To understand the world, we must see it from different angles. Never stop searching. Go deeper. Go further. Be open-minded. Be engaged. Open the door through dialogue, where ideas do matter.